I want you to imagine something. You are lying in a hospital bed. You have been in that bed for 3 days. You are wearing a gown that ties in the back and does not quite close all the way, and the pillow has that specific hospital smell that you never quite forget once you have encountered it. You have tubes in your arm. You have not slept properly since Tuesday. Your body has been through something that required a surgeon and 2 separate procedures and a recovery that the doctor described as significant. You are 31 years old. You are exhausted. You are scared. You are alone because your husband had to go back to work and visiting hours do not start for another 40 minutes. And then the door opens. And your mother-in-law walks in. 40 minutes before visiting hours. Because she has never once in 7 years let a rule apply to her. She closes the door behind her. She pulls the chair close to your bed. Not the chair at the normal visiting distance. The close chair. The chair that means she wants this to be private. She looks at you for a moment. You look back at her. And then she says it. In the quiet voice she uses when she wants to make sure something lands. She says, "I have always thought my son deserves better than broken." And she stands up. And she leaves. She is in that room for less than 4 minutes. She says 9 words that she has been saving for exactly the right moment. And then she walks out. And you lie there. In a hospital bed. With tubes in your arm. And you breathe. And you think. And 40 minutes later the door opens again. But it is not visiting hours starting. It is something else entirely. And in the next 10 minutes everything that woman built in 7 years comes apart. Not because of something you did. Because of what walked through that door. My name is Vivian Cross. I am 34 years old. I am a nurse practitioner, which means I have spent my entire career in hospitals, and I understand exactly what they are. They are places where the truth has nowhere to hide. Where the body says what the mouth won't. Where everything that has been quietly building finally comes to a point. That hospital room was the point. 7 years of building. 4 minutes. 9 words. And then the door. Stay with me. Because this story starts long before that hospital bed. And it ends somewhere nobody in that room was expecting. Subscribe right now because this channel is where stories like this one live. The real ones. The ones that take time because they took time to happen. Hit that button and let's get into it. Let me tell you about Diane Mercer. Because Diane is the kind of person you need to understand completely before any of the rest of this makes sense. Diane Mercer is 63 years old. She is the kind of woman who is always perfectly put together. Not expensively. Precisely. There is a difference. Expensive is about money. Precise is about control. Diane's clothes are always pressed. Her hair is always set. Her home is immaculate in the way of homes where someone is constantly and quietly and relentlessly managing the appearance of things. She is a retired school administrator. She ran the same elementary school for 22 years. She was, by all accounts I have gathered from people who were there, a very effective administrator. Effective in the way that certain people are effective. Not warm. Not beloved. Effective. The kind of effective that comes from being very clear about what you want and very patient about getting it and very skilled at making other people feel like your preference was actually their idea. She has 1 child. Marcus. My husband. Marcus Anthony Mercer. Who she refers to always in the possessive. My son. Not Marcus. My son. The way you refer to something that belongs to you. Not someone. Something. I need to tell you about Marcus too because Marcus is not a villain in this story. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. Marcus is a good man. He is a good man who was raised by a woman who needed him to be the most important thing in her life, and who communicated that need so consistently and so skillfully over 35 years that it had become structural for him. Like a load-bearing wall. You don't notice a load-bearing wall until someone tries to move it. And then the ceiling gets complicated. Marcus is thoughtful. He is genuinely kind. He listens. He noticed me. Which after a childhood of being the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who got the 2-word acknowledgement at the dinner table, being noticed by someone like Marcus felt like stepping into a room that had been specifically designed for you. He saw me. He chose me. He chose me in front of Diane. Which was the beginning of everything. I met Marcus at a hospital. Not as patients. He was there visiting a colleague who had been in an accident. I was coming off a double shift. I was wearing scrubs that had seen better days and my hair was in the kind of bun that happens at hour 16 of a shift, and I was approximately 40% asleep on my feet heading toward the parking lot. He was in the elevator. He held the door. I got in. He looked at me and said, "Long shift?" I said, "Is it that obvious?" He said, "You have what appears to be coffee and possibly something medical on your left sleeve, and you are carrying your shoes." I looked down. I was indeed carrying my shoes. I did not remember taking them off. He laughed. I laughed. We talked in the elevator and then in the parking lot and then for another hour sitting on the hood of my car in the hospital parking garage at 11 p.m. By the end of that conversation I had his number, and the specific feeling of having been seen by someone who was paying attention. We dated for 8 months before he took me to meet Diane. In retrospect, that timeline tells you something. 8 months is a long time before a meeting. Marcus, who I would come to understand was very skilled at managing the space between his mother and the rest of his life, had been preparing. For 8 months he had been preparing both of us. Me for Diane. Diane for me. The dinner was at her house. Her immaculate, precisely managed house. I brought flowers. She put them in a vase in the kitchen where we could not see them from the dining room. I brought wine. She thanked me and put it away. She had already selected the wine. We ate. The food was extraordinary. She was an excellent cook. Everything was exactly right. The table was exactly right. The conversation was exactly right. And underneath the exactness of everything was a current I felt but could not name. A kind of attention that was too focused to be warm. The specific attention of someone who is assessing. She asked me questions. About my work. About my family. About my education. About my plans. They were the right questions. Politely asked. But questions have a way of being about more than what they are asking. Her questions were about whether I was enough. Enough for her son. Enough for her standard. Enough for whatever image she had been building of the woman who would eventually enter this picture. I answered honestly. I was a nurse practitioner. My family was ordinary and loving. My education was solid. My plans were to keep doing work I found meaningful. None of it was wrong. But I could feel, in the specific way that women feel things that are not being said, that none of it was quite right either. Not for Diane's picture. Not for Diane's son. Not for the life she had been designing. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment and thought about what had happened. I could not point to a single specific thing. She had not been rude. She had not said anything wrong. She had been perfectly precise. And underneath the precision was the very clear and very quiet message that I had not passed a test I had not known I was taking. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself it was first meeting nerves. I told myself that mothers of only sons were protective, and that this was normal, and that it would get better as she got to know me. I was right about one of those things. Mothers of only sons were often protective. This was true. The other things I was wrong about. It did not get better. It never once got better. Just got more precise. Marcus and I got married 2 years after the parking garage. The wedding was beautiful. The wedding was also the first time I understood that Diane's relationship to events in Marcus's life was to experience them as things happening to her. Not to us. To her. She cried at the ceremony. Long visible tears. The kind that required dabbing. Marcus squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. And I thought, here we go. The 7 years of marriage that followed were genuinely good in most of the ways that marriages are good or not good. Marcus and I were a good team. We communicated. We made each other laugh. We built a life together that felt like ours in the specific way that things are yours when you have chosen them deliberately. And Diane was always there. At the edge of everything. Precise. Patient. Relentless in the way that water is relentless. Water does not attack. Water finds the cracks. And then water sits in the cracks. And then water expands. The comments came in forms that were always deniable. A look when I served something at dinner she would not have served. A question about whether I was sure about a decision that contained just enough doubt to plant something. A comparison to Marcus's previous girlfriend, delivered casually, that always ended with something she did differently. Nothing you could hold up. Nothing you could point to. Nothing that would survive the translation of, she said this specific thing and it hurt. Because the specific thing isolated was never quite enough. It was only an aggregate, only across 7 years that you could see the architecture of it. The careful, patient, precise architecture of a woman who had decided that the person her son had chosen was not right, and who had been quietly, consistently, precisely making that case. To herself, to Marcus, to anyone who would receive it, without ever saying it directly, until the hospital, until the 4 minutes, until the 9 words, which was when she finally said it directly, because she thought nobody else was in range to hear it. She was wrong about that. I need to tell you why I was in that hospital bed. Because the why matters. Not for sympathy. For context. I have a condition. I am not going to name it specifically because it is mine and the name is not the point. What the name means practically is this. My body occasionally decides to do something that requires medical intervention. This had happened twice before in the 7 years Marcus and I had been together. Both times Diane had reacted to my hospitalizations in the specific way she reacted to everything that complicated her picture. With a kind of careful distance that presented as concern but functioned as inconvenience. The first time Marcus had stayed at the hospital overnight. Diane had called him 3 times before midnight. Not to ask about me. To ask about him. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? This must be so hard for you. The second time she had arrived at the hospital the day after and sat in the chair in my room, and talked to Marcus for 45 minutes about a problem at her house that needed his attention. While I was in the bed, with tubes in my arm, while she was in the chair next to the bed, talking to Marcus, about her gutters. I had filed it away, the way I was learning to file things, carefully, accurately, without letting the filing become attachment. The third hospitalization was the one with the 9 words. It was the worst of the 3 medically. The procedures were more involved. The recovery was longer. Marcus had been there the first 2 days. On the 3rd day he had to go back to work because we had a mortgage and he had used his emergency leave and the practical realities of adult life did not pause for hospital stays. I had told him to go. I had meant it. I was a nurse practitioner. I understood what was happening to my body. I was stable. I was tired and sore and scared in the background way that you are scared when your body keeps doing things that require surgical correction. But I was stable. And I was alone. And visiting hours started at 2 p.m. And at 1:20 the door opened. And Diane walked in. 40 minutes early. With her precise hair and her pressed clothes and the chair pulled close. She sat down. She looked at me for a moment. I looked back at her. I was not going to help her with whatever she had come to do. 9 words. She said them slowly, with the specific pacing of someone who has rehearsed. I have always thought my son deserves better than broken. Then she stood up. She smoothed her jacket. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle. She said, "I hope you feel better soon." And she left. I lay in that bed and I breathed. 1 breath. 2 breaths. The monitor beside me beeped its steady rhythm. My arm with the tubes in it lay on top of the blanket. Outside the window the afternoon was doing whatever afternoons do, when the world is not stopping for what just happened inside a hospital room. I breathed. And I felt something I want to describe carefully because it was not what you might expect. It was not devastation. It was not collapse. It was not the tears in the dark moment. It was clarity. The same clarity I felt 9 years later at a kitchen table. The clarity that arrives when something that has been vague and deniable and ambient for years is finally said out loud. Finally named. By the person doing it. In plain language. No deniability. No, it was just a question or I was only concerned. 9 words. Direct. Final. Accurate from her perspective. And in the accuracy of her words I found strangely a kind of relief. Because I had spent 7 years wondering if I was imagining it. Whether the current underneath the precision was real or whether I was constructing something from nothing. And now I knew. I was not constructing anything. It was real. It had always been real. She had just handed me the proof. In 9 words. In a hospital room 40 minutes before visiting hours. I reached for my phone. Not to call Marcus. Not yet. I called my sister. My sister Catherine, who is 3 years older than me, and who is a family law attorney and who has known about Diane for 7 years and who has been very patient and very careful with me about all of it because she knew I needed to arrive at my own conclusions in my own time. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what Diane had said. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where are you right now?" I said, "Still in the hospital." She said, "I'm coming." I said, "Visiting hours don't start until 2. She said, "I know." And she hung up. I need to tell you about Catherine before I tell you what happened when she arrived. Catherine Cross, who is now Catherine Cross Abrams because she married a man named David 3 years ago, and hyphenated because she said she'd spent 38 years building that name, and she was not abandoning it for anyone. Catherine is 5 feet 2 inches tall. She is a family law attorney in the city. She has been practicing for 12 years. She has, in 12 years of family law, seen approximately everything that one human being can do to another human being within the context of a family structure. This has given her a very specific quality, the quality of someone who cannot be surprised. Not hardened, not cold, just genuinely, thoroughly unsurprisable. She has also for 7 years been watching what Diane Mercer did to her sister. Quietly, carefully, filing it away the way attorneys file things, with dates and details and the specific memory of someone who understands that patterns are only useful when they are documented. She had been waiting, not for something to happen, for me to be ready. She arrived at the hospital at 1:58 p.m., 2 minutes before visiting hours. She had driven 45 minutes in 43 minutes. She came through the door with her coat still on and her bag over her shoulder, and she crossed the room and she sat in the chair next to my bed. The same chair. The chair Diane had moved close. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "Tell me exactly what she said." The exact words. I told her. She took out her phone and she typed it. She said, "And she said this when you were alone. No witness." I said, "No witness." Catherine nodded. She put her phone in her bag. Then she said, "Viv, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." I said, "Okay." She said, "I have been waiting to tell you this for 3 years. Because it wasn't the right time before. Because you weren't ready before and I wasn't willing to push you before you were ready. But what she just said to you in this room changes the timeline." I said, "What do you mean?" And Catherine told me something. Something she had found 3 years earlier during a conversation with a colleague. Something she had kept because the time was not right. The time was right now. 3 years before the hospital, Catherine had been at a bar association event. A networking thing. The kind where you stand around with a drink and talk to people you half know about things that are half interesting. She had been talking to a colleague named Rachel. Rachel worked in estate law. Rachel mentioned, in the casual way of conversation at a bar association event, a case she had been working on. She did not name names. Attorneys do not name names at bar association events. But she described a structure. A trust structure. Established by a woman late 50s, for the benefit of her only son. A trust that had been set up with very specific conditions. Conditions around marriage. Conditions around the continuation of the marriage. Conditions around what would and would not be distributed to the son and his spouse depending on the status of the marriage at the time of distribution. Catherine had listened and felt something. The specific feeling of recognition. She asked Rachel a question. Careful question. About the general nature of these conditions. Rachel said, "Essentially the trust is structured so that if the marriage dissolves the son receives the full benefit. If the marriage continues the benefit is shared. The incentive is clear." Catherine had gone home that night and sat at her kitchen table. She had thought about Diane Mercer. About the 7 years of precise patient erosion. About the current underneath the precision. About the architecture of it. And she had thought, what if the erosion is not just personal? What if the erosion is financial? What if there is a structure underneath the structure? She had not done anything with that thought. Because she did not have evidence. Because I was not ready. Because the timing was not right. But she had kept the thought. Filed it. The way attorneys file things. Waiting. And then her sister had called from a hospital bed and told her that Diane Mercer had sat in the close chair and said 9 words that removed all remaining deniability. And Catherine had driven 45 minutes in 43 minutes. And now she was sitting in that chair. Telling me, I want to be honest about the next part. Because it was not immediate. And it was not dramatic. And it was not the kind of thing that happens in a single scene. It happened over 3 months. Carefully. Precisely. The way certain things need to happen when they need to hold up. Catherine connected me with a colleague, an estate attorney named Philip Osei who specialized in trust structures and who had, over 20 years, seen approximately everything that can be done inside a trust document. I gave Philip what I had, which was not much. The name of the trust company Marcus had mentioned once in passing. A conversation Marcus and I had had about inheritance in the abstract. A sense of the structure without the document. Philip made some calls. And Philip found the document. Legally. Through the appropriate channels. Through the fact that certain trust documents are matters of partial public record in certain circumstances. And Philip read the document. And Philip called Catherine. And Catherine called me. And what she said on that call I am going to describe carefully because the details matter. The trust had been established 11 years earlier. 2 years before Marcus and I met. Which meant Diane had established it before I existed in the picture. Which meant it was not about me specifically. It was about anyone. Anyone who was not Diane. Anyone who stood between Diane and the gravitational center of her son's life. The trust held a significant sum. The kind of sum that is life-changing. The kind that represents decades of careful accumulation. The trust was structured as Catherine's colleague had described. Upon dissolution of Marcus's marriage, the full benefit transferred to him alone. Upon continuation of the marriage past a certain point, the benefit was to be shared equally between Marcus and his spouse. That point was the 10-year anniversary of the marriage. Our 10th anniversary was 14 months away. Diane had spent 7 years being precise and patient and relentless. She had 14 months to go. And she had gotten impatient. And she had walked into a hospital room 40 minutes before visiting hours. And she had said 9 words to a woman she thought was alone. She was not alone. She had a phone. And a sister. And a sister who was a family attorney. And a sister who had been waiting 3 years for the right moment. I need to tell you about telling Marcus. Because Marcus is the center of this. Marcus always was. This was never really about me and Diane. It was about Marcus. About what his mother had been doing in his name. Without his knowledge. I told him on a Sunday. We were at home. I had been home from the hospital for 2 weeks. I sat him down at the kitchen table. I told him everything. In order. The parking garage and the 8 months and the first dinner and the 7 years and the gutters and the 9 words. I told him about Catherine. About the Bar Association event. About Philip Osei. About the trust document. I told him all of it. And I watched his face. Marcus has a face that does not hide things well. He has never been good at hiding things. It is one of the things I love about him. He went through several expressions. The first was disbelief. The reflexive, protective disbelief of someone who loves their parent. The second was the beginning of understanding. The slow, terrible understanding that arrives when you are looking at something that fits. That fits too well. That connects too many things that you have been keeping separate in your mind because connecting them would require you to look at something you did not want to look at. The third was something I had never seen on his face before. Something quiet and heavy and very still. He looked at the table. He said, "How long have you known about the trust?" I said, 3 months. He said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I needed to be sure. And because I needed to decide what I wanted to do about it." He looked up. I said, "I am telling you now because you deserve to know. Not because I want to use it against her. Not because I want to blow anything up. Because you deserve to know what has been happening in your name." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She said that to you? In the hospital?" I said, "Yes." He said, "While you were alone?" I said, "Yes." He put his hands flat on the table. The same flat hands, I thought. The same gesture as his mother in the conference room I had imagined. Then he said, "I'm going to call her." I said, "Marcus." He said, "I'm going to call her right now." I said, "Okay." And I left him alone in the kitchen. And I went to the bedroom and I sat on the bed and I listened to the low sound of his voice through the wall and I could not hear the words but I could hear the tone. And the tone said everything. I was not in the room when Marcus called Diane. I will never know exactly what was said. What I know is what Marcus told me afterward. He stood in the kitchen and he called his mother and he told her that he knew. About the trust. About the structure. About the conditions. He told her what Vivian had told him about the hospital. The 9 words. Diane's response, Marcus told me, was to deny the hospital first. That was her first move. She said she did not say that. She said I had misremembered. She said I was confused. She said I had been on medication. Marcus said, Vivian does not confuse things. Then Diane moved to the trust. She said she was protecting him. She said she was making sure he was taken care of. She said that any mother would do the same. Marcus said, You were trying to end my marriage, Mom. She said, I was trying to protect what you built. He said, You were trying to protect what you built. My marriage is not yours. She said, I know what's best for you. I have always known. And Marcus said something then that he told me later. He said, I know you believe that. I know you have always believed that. But what's best for me is my wife. And what you have been doing to her for 7 years is something I should have seen and stopped, and I am sorry I didn't. Diane was quiet. Then she said, You'll see eventually. Marcus said, No, I won't. And he hung up. He came into the bedroom and sat beside me on the bed, and we sat there for a while. Not talking. Just present. The way we had learned to be in the years of doing this together. After a while he said, I owe you an apology. I said, Marcus. He said, 7 years. I saw things and I told myself they were not what they were. I made it easier for her than it should have been. I'm sorry. I looked at him. I said, You are apologizing to me right now. He said, Yes. I said, In our bedroom. He said, Yes. I said, That is going to have to be enough for me to hold on to for a while. He said, I know. And we sat there. On the bed. In our home. That was ours. And that was going to stay ours. For 14 more months. And then for as long after that as we chose. Philip Osei advised us carefully. He is a very careful man. He said the trust was legally valid. He said the conditions were unusual but not unprecedented. He said that what Diane had done was not illegal. He said it was, however, documented. And he said that documentation changes certain things. What happened next I am going to describe without specific legal details because those details belong to Philip and to the process and to Marcus. What I will tell you is this. Marcus retained his own attorney. An attorney who was not Philip and was not Catherine. A completely independent attorney. Who reviewed the trust document. Who reviewed the conditions. Who had a conversation with Diane's attorney. That conversation resulted in certain modifications to the trust structure. Modifications that reflected the reality of the situation. The reality being, the marriage was not dissolving. The marriage was continuing. And would continue past the 10-year mark. And the conditions that had been designed to incentivize its dissolution were now on the record as something that had been discovered and documented and discussed between attorneys. Diane's attorney was, apparently, not entirely surprised. People who work in estate law see the full range of what love can look like when it becomes controlling. The modifications were made. The timeline became irrelevant. The architecture that Diane had been building for 11 years became a historical document rather than an active strategy. Did not feel like victory. I want to be clear about that. Felt like grief. The grief of having seen something clearly that you had spent 7 years trying not to see. The grief of watching your husband grieve the version of his mother that had always existed underneath the one he loved. The grief of understanding that some people love you with the full force of their capacity, and that capacity is simply not as large as the love they require in return. Diane loved Marcus. I have never doubted that. She loved him the way people love things they cannot let go of, which is not the same as loving someone the way they deserve. But it was real. And watching Marcus reckon with that reality was the hardest thing about any of it. Our 10th anniversary was 11 months after the hospital. Not 14. Because Philip's modifications had removed the timeline as a relevant factor. But we celebrated it anyway. Not because of the trust. Because 10 years is 10 years. We went to the restaurant where we had our first real date. Not the parking garage. The restaurant after. We sat at a corner table and ate dinner and talked about the 10 years and what they had been and what we had learned from them. Marcus said, I keep thinking about the parking garage. I said, the hood of my car. He said, you were carrying your shoes. I said, I don't know why I took them off. He said, I'm glad you did. We ate. And somewhere in the middle of the meal I thought about Diane. About 9 words. About the precise chair. About 11 years of a trust document. About a woman who had loved her son so completely and so specifically that she had been unable to let him be loved by anyone else without treating it as a threat. I felt sad for her. I mean that. Not as performance. Not as the generous magnanimous thing you say. Actually sad. Because she had spent 11 years building something designed to keep her son close. And what it had actually done was the opposite. The distance between Marcus and Diane now was not because of me. It was not because of the trust. It was because of what the trust revealed. What the 9 words revealed. What 7 years of precision finally revealed when it was said out loud. That she had chosen the architecture of her fear over the actual relationship with her son. And he had seen it. And you cannot unsee something like that. Marcus still talks to his mother. I want you to know that. He calls her. Not as often. But he calls. Because she is his mother and he loves her and the love is real even when the relationship is changed. But the calls are different now. They are honest in a way they were not before. And Diane, who is a precise and careful woman, has understood what the honesty means. She has adjusted. Slowly. Without grace exactly. But without pretending. And that is more than some people manage. I am going to say something that I think is important. This story is about a mother-in-law. But it is really about a question that a lot of people in a lot of relationships eventually have to answer. What do you do when someone you love is loved by someone who cannot share? Because Diane's problem was not that she disliked me. Her problem was that she could not share Marcus. Not with me specifically. With anyone. With any life that was not organized around her. And that specific inability is not unusual. It is not rare. It sits at the center of a very large number of family conflicts that look like they are about something else. The comments about the cooking. The questions about the decisions. The comparisons to the previous girlfriend. The gutters during the hospital stay. None of it was about cooking or decisions or girlfriends or gutters. All of it was about the one thing. The inability to let the person she loved the most belong to himself. I am not telling you this story to make you angry at Diane. I am not telling it to hand you a villain. I am telling it because I think a lot of people listening right now have a Diane in their life. Person who loves someone you love. Who loves them in a way that leaves no room. Who loves them in a way that requires you to disappear. Who builds structures, visible and invisible, designed to make the space between you and the person you love just slightly uncomfortable. Just slightly. Deniably. Consistently. For years. And I want you to know. You are not imagining it. The current underneath the precision is real. And it does not require a trust document to be real. It is real in the looks and the questions and the comparisons and the chairs pulled close. It is real in the 9 words said 40 minutes before visiting hours to a woman alone in a hospital bed. It is real. And you are allowed to see it clearly. And you are allowed to say so. And you are allowed to have a Catherine. Someone who has been watching. Who has been waiting for the right moment. Who will drive 45 minutes in 43 minutes when you call. Find your Catherine. And when she says it's time, listen. Okay, we have been here a while. My name is Vivian Cross. Marcus and I celebrated our 10th anniversary last month. We are still in our home. Our home. That belongs to us. Not to a trust structure. Not to a condition. To us. I still work in the hospital. I still wear scrubs that see better days. I am not currently carrying my shoes in the parking garage, but I make no promises. Catherine calls me every Sunday. We make dinner sometimes. She is still unsurprisable. I love her for it. Diane is Diane. She will always be Diane. Precise and patient and relentless. But the architecture she was building is different now. Built on a different foundation. Whether that foundation holds is up to her. I hope it does. Not for me. For Marcus. Because he deserves a mother who loves him without conditions. And because even the people who hurt us deserve to eventually find a way to do better. If this story hits something real, drop a comment. Tell me if you have a Diane. Tell me if you have found your Catherine. Tell me if you are still in the middle of the 7 years and cannot yet see the end of it. I read everything. I am here. Share this if someone needs to hear it. Subscribe if you are new. New story every single day. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.